In 1954, the German-born American psychiatrist Frederick Wertham published Seduction of the Innocent, a fiery indictment of comic books that incited a moral panic. Wertham, who specialized in examining children, concluded that the violent and salacious imagery in comics led impressionable kids to juvenile delinquency. Wertham's main targets in Seduction of the Innocent were horror stories and true crime tales, but he did spare a moment to accuse superhero comics of grooming young minds into becoming homosexual. Wertham notes that one of his patients was gay and that he was fond of Batman's adventures. Seizing upon this, Wertham leaps to the conclusion that Batman and Robin's beautifully landscaped and warmly lighted mansion was homoerotic propaganda. He added that the strength and independence attributed to Wonder Woman and Catwoman were teaching young girls how to become lesbians. Moral panics based on conspirational thinking and ridiculous fallacies are hardly a rare occurrence in American history. For instance, in the earlier years of the 20th century, Reverend F.G. Esper led a shockingly popular campaign against teddy bears, theorizing that replacing baby dolls with stuffed animals would cause little girls to grow up without cultivating a maternal instinct. Most other moral panics have about as many objective facts and sound reasoning as what Esper brought to the table, but they can still bring about serious consequences despite how provably silly they are. Wertham's crusade resulted in congressional hearings. His main piece of evidence in this crusade was that most of the juvenile criminals and gay people he examined were comic book readers. That's an obvious example of how correlation doesn't necessarily mean causation. After all, the number of wild boar attacks has increased significantly since 9/11. However, people still took Wertham seriously, and while Congress didn't take any direct action against the comic book industry, angry parents, teachers, and pastors still organized burnings, boycotts, and protests. The comics publishers that survived the moral panic responded by forming the Comics Code Authority, a self-censorship board that policed the contents of every periodical. Soon enough, it became clear that no comic book could make it to the stands unless it submitted to the dictates of the code. I'll reiterate that the key stated goal of both Wertham and the Code was to suppress the horror genre and to avoid glorifying criminal activities. But mid-20th century America was a place where queerness was seen as an illegal, morally depraved mental illness. There was absolutely no way that any kind of existence outside of the cishet framework would even be acknowledged in most mainstream media, much less depicted in a light of understanding, compassion, or even tolerance. Comics proved to be no exception to this. That isn't, of course, to say that there weren't queer creators of comics in those days. The first openly gay comic book artist of note was arguably Tom of Finland, who began producing erotic content that he sold through clandestine mail order in the late 1940s. And yes, while most queer creators could not be as open about themselves as Tom of Finland, that isn't to say that elements of their lives did not factor into their art. It is impossible for an artist to create art that does not reflect who they are in any way at all whatsoever. And naturally, even without factoring in the illegal content mills of pornographic comics that had proliferated since at least the 1920s, there were certain corners of the comics world that the code was unable to reach. One such area was the magazine format. William Gaines, the publisher of Tales from the Crypt and one of Wertham's main targets, ultimately responded to the code by canceling all his comics except the parody series Mad. In 1955, Gaines converted Mad to magazine dimensions in order to evade code scrutiny. Mad then grew into a wildly successful title in the 1960s, spawning scores of imitators and creating a niche for black and white comic magazines marketed to older children and young adults. James Warren, publisher of Famous Monsters of Filmland, noticed Mad's success and, starting in 1964, began publishing horror comics in the same magazine format as Mad. Inspired by illegal porn comics, Mad, the Warren magazines, and their cottage industry of knockoffs, young baby boomer artists began self-publishing their own comics starting in around 1967. Also influenced by the civil rights movement, the feminist movement, and other facets of 1960s counterculture, the underground comics scene centered in San Francisco reveled in satirical, socially conscious themes while directly addressing subjects forbidden by the code, including explicit drug use, frank sexuality, graphic violence, and resistance to authority figures. The newsstands and pharmacies that stocked mainstream comics wouldn't touch this stuff with a 10-foot pole, but underground comics found retail space in head shops. These were stores that sold drug paraphernalia. The earliest and most influential practitioners of underground comics were cishet white men from relatively comfortable working-class families in the suburbs, but the popularity of trailblazing comics like Zap and the Fabulous Furry Freak Brothers soon motivated women, people of color, and the queer community to take this emerging idiom and make it their own. Because the earliest underground comics were created by the aforementioned cishet white men, they by and large depicted queer people as lisping stereotypes, butch man-haters, and comedic transvestites. One of the first exceptions was Sandy Comes Out, a Trina Robbins story that appeared in the debut issue of Women's Comics in 1972. At almost the same time, Mary Wings broke fresh ground with the one-shot lesbian book Come Out Comics. Women's comics contributor Roberta Gregory would then expand the field of lesbian comics further with 1976's Dynamite Damsels. Underground comics created by and intended for queer people grew steadily as the 1970s continued. The most prominent title during this period was arguably Gay Heartthrobs, edited by Larry Fuller and featuring artwork by low-budget camp filmmaker Mike Kuchar. Gay Heartthrobs struggled to find an audience, but it led to other titles that would have a much bigger impact. An overview of queer trailblazers in the salad days of underground comics would, however, be incomplete without mentioning Vaughn Bodie, whose spiritual curiosity, genderqueer perspective, and playful fantasy cartooning proved greatly influential to not only comics but also street art and animation. That being said, the most significant figure in queer underground comics is arguably Howard Cruz. First gaining attention for his surreal comic Barefoots, Cruz cultivated a reputation for being a funny, creative artist who wasn't nearly as self-consciously edgy as his peers. Cruz's career took a sharp turn when publisher Dennis Kitchen asked him to edit the anthology Gay Comics in 1980. Consciously intended to focus more on interpersonal relationships and slice-of-life issues than on sex, Gay Comics was an important early platform for Alison Bechdel, and it showcased the maturation of older creators like Wings and Gregory. While he was editing Gay Comics, Cruz was also writing and illustrating Wendell, an ongoing comic strip centering on a young, idealistic gay man dealing with friends, family, small personal struggles, and wider national issues such as the AIDS crisis. While Gay Comics charted how underground cartoonists were growing up, their roots in hedonistic excess was celebrated by Meat Men, an anthology of gay male comics. Published in 26 volumes between 1986 and 2004, Meat Men packaged an assortment of humorous gay erotica in 160 to 200 page chunks per issue. Edited by Winston Leyland, Meat Men strived to include every gay cartoonist of note and did a pretty good job of it. Everyone from Cruz to Tom of Finland contributed. While underground comics were able to evade the Comics Code Authority, the 1973 Supreme Court case Miller v. California enabled local communities to determine how to weigh the First Amendment against their own standards of obscenity. Reactionaries pushing back against hippie idealism found underground comics to be a convenient scapegoat and, unsurprisingly, were especially harsh on any comic that tried to celebrate or normalize queerness. These groups also promoted laws that closed most of America's head shops, cutting underground comics off from the only brick-and-mortar stores that were willing to carry them. These sorts of attacks continued up into the 21st century, notably demonstrated by a case where 2 volumes of Meat Men were seized by Canadian Customs. This led to the Canadian Supreme Court case Little Sister's Book and Art Emporium v. Canada. The comics industry changed yet again when specialty comic book stores began proliferating in the early 1980s. Among other things, this meant that self-published and small press comics had a distribution network outside of mail order for the first time since the head shops were closed down. This led to what was eventually known as the Black and White Explosion, where thousands of alternative comics flooded the market. Driven by the popularity of titles like Cerberus and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, underground cartoonists enjoyed a creative renaissance while younger creators influenced by the emerging punk rock subculture began building an audience. Of course, American comics was hardly the only corner of the medium that held queer perspectives. Europe, Asia, Latin America, and every other part of the global comics community has a complex and ongoing history of queer artistry as well. These voices intersect with their American counterparts in a multitude of ways, but for the purposes of brevity, I'll have to narrow my focus largely to my own country in this basic rundown. Up until the late 1970s, queer comics were confined solely to venues outside of the mainstream, but the direct market of comic book stores would change this as well. In 1982, DC Comics published Camelot 3000 by writer Mike W. Barr and illustrator Brian Bolland. This series, which centers upon reincarnations of King Arthur and his knights fending off an alien invasion in the distant future, was sold exclusively in comic book stores and did not seek code approval. Among its other facets, Camelot 3000 features a queer romance and a thinly veiled transgender metaphor in its stated text. In addition to signaling that mainstream publishers were going to market its content to adult readers much more prominently going forward, Camelot 3000 also demonstrated how major comics companies would gradually become less and less skittish about directly addressing queer identity in its pages. Of course, having Marvel and DC feature queer characters did not mean that alternative comics had no further places to go. The increasing popularity of graphic novels in the 90s would eventually lead to queer creators venturing into longer form work. In 1995, Howard Cruz published Stuck Rubber Baby through DC's alternative comics imprint Piranha Press, a semi-autobiographical graphic novel about a teenage boy who realizes that he's gay while volunteering for the civil rights movement. Stuck Rubber Baby made waves and was reissued several times. Its impact, however, was eclipsed by 2006's Fun Home, a family tragicomic. Written and illustrated by Alison Bechdel, Fun Home is a graphic memoir framing Bechdel's lesbian awakening around her father's closeted gayness and his eventual suicide. Fun Home was adapted into a stage musical in 2013, while its 2015 Broadway production won the Tony for Best Musical. That, of course, isn't even getting into the popularity of queer identity and the boom of webcomics starting in the early 2000s and persisting to the present day. At this point, queerness in comics is commonplace and could plausibly become completely normalized in the foreseeable future. Unfortunately, reactionary movements against the queer community have been galvanized by the elections of populist, authoritarian strongmen in the mid to late 2010s. Comics are a very popular target for book banning since, as they are illustrated, it is very easy for individuals to flip through the pages and point out passages that they object to out of context. Out of all the books that are challenged by reactionaries in recent years, comics with queer characters are among the most frequently attacked. While we have made great progress as a society since the days of Frederick Wortham, America still has no shortage of powerful people who believe that queerness is a morally depraved mental illness that needs to be stamped out. That being said, the flailing efforts of these reactionaries and the moral panics they instigate are undeniably coming off as more desperate and sensationalistic than ever. Their attacks, whether they come in the form of terrorist attacks at drag shows or in the shape of trying to ban Raina Telgemeyer's drama, are growing in savagery because reactionaries know that they are losing. The hearts and minds of the public are increasingly moving away from intolerance, and while there's still much more work to be done, a better world for everyone remains possible. It is often argued that representation matters in the media we consume, and while it is a net good for those in marginalized groups to see creators and characters who look like them, it goes beyond even that vital facet. It has been demonstrably proven that kids who grew up consuming media with humanizing portrayals of marginalized groups are far more likely to grow into adults who oppose the persecution, oppression, and othering of these groups. While I do think that many reactionaries are sincerely convinced that exposure to queer-affirming media will somehow groom children into becoming queer, I suspect that more than a few of them realize that this is utterly absurd. These reactionaries may, however, understand that exposure to queer-affirming media can play a hand in kids becoming more apt to regard their queer friends, relatives, neighbors, and classmates with empathy, compassion, and understanding rather than hatred. That runs counter to the reactionary agenda and, by their perspective, needs to be stymied by any means necessary. The inclusion of queer voices in comics is a very small part of the struggle for a better future, but it remains a part of it nonetheless. Queerness has been in comics from its onset, and while efforts have been made to silence or erase this history, it has and will continue to endure.